On that soft June afternoon, when the laburnum in the vicarage garden hung its golden chains and the air smelt faintly of cut grass and rose leaves, there seemed no more unlikely setting for murder than the village of St. Mary Mead. The vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, declared, half in pride, half in alarm, that the village was getting quite dreadfully sophisticated. This remark was prompted by the elaborate arrangements currently adorning her lawn. Under a striped marquee stood a long trestle table flanked by folding chairs, and on the table, arranged with almost reverential precision, were porcelain tea bowls, a jade-green teapot, curious wooden implements, and a length of silk embroidered with dragons. There was even, as Mrs. Price Ridley observed with some suspicion, a sort of whisk. "It is called a chasen," said Mr. Lionel Blake, pronouncing the foreign word with comfortable authority. He was a stout, smooth-faced man of about 50, dressed a shade too expensively for the country, for the whisking of the powdered tea. "Authentic, you know. All quite authentic," Griselda laughed. "Lionel, if this Chinese tea ceremony of yours turns out to be nothing more than strong tea and theatricals, the village will never forgive me." "The village," said Mr. Blake, his eyes travelling over the assembled guests, "will be enchanted. Besides, I have promised the Women's Institute the whole of the proceeds. Nobody can grumble at being exotic for charity." It was the sort of remark that caused some tightening of lips amongst the older ladies. They did not like to be thought capable of grumbling, though grumbling was in fact their chief consolation. In a wicker chair, a little to one side of the general bustle, Miss Jane Marple sat placidly knitting something white and complicated. She appeared, as usual, to be paying very little attention. In reality, her pale blue eyes missed very little indeed. She noted, for instance, the rigid set of Mrs. Price Ridley's shoulders as Mr. Blake spoke, the way young Cynthia Blake, Lionel's niece, flushed painfully when addressed by Dr. Haydock, the slight hesitation, barely a fraction of a second, before Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, took Mr. Blake's proffered hand. These things were of no importance, naturally. They never were, until suddenly they were of the first importance. "Such a to-do over tea," murmured Miss Marple to herself, drawing her yarn through with small bird-like motions. "Though I suppose tea has often enough been at the bottom of trouble. The Boston business, and that dreadful poisoning in Leeds, very odd. How often beverages are involved." The vicar, beaming and slightly flustered, rang a small handbell. "If I might have everyone's attention?" Mr. Blake will now demonstrate the Chinese tea ceremony. You will see that civilization did not begin with the British teapot. There was a polite ripple of laughter, chairs scraped, hats bobbed, and people shuffled closer under the marquee. The afternoon sun turned the canvas into a pale golden dome. Outside, the bees went on with their decent unimaginative work among the roses. Mr. Blake took his place behind the table, his movements practised and almost priestly. On a lower stool beside him knelt a slim dark-haired woman in a plain grey dress, Miss Lee, his assistant and cultural adviser, as he had loftily described her to Griselda. "She looks very foreign," Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to Miss Marple, as though Miss Marple had ordered her specially. "You never know where you are with foreigners. One can't expect, well, the same standards." Miss Marple said mildly, "I have generally found human nature much alike everywhere, Mrs. Price Ridley. Allowing for small local variations, of course." On the table, water was poured with a delicate, measured sound. Mr. Blake spoke of dynasties and contemplation, of purity and patience. He lifted a small lacquered casket, opened it solemnly, and displayed the vivid green powder within. "Matcha," he announced. "Powdered tea of the highest quality. Not ordinarily obtainable." Dr. Haydock, standing at the back, muttered to Colonel Melchett, "Looks beastly. Like cattle medicine." The whisper floated, half-heard across the tent. Miss Marple's needles clicked. She watched the careful whisking, the froth forming in the bowls, the almost theatrical gravity with which Mr. Blake handed the first cup to Griselda as hostess. Griselda sipped, coughed slightly, and laughed. "It tastes like drinking a hedge," she declared cheerfully. but a very cultured hedge. More laughter. Cups changed hands. Reactions varied. Amusement, politeness, the odd grimace quickly suppressed. Through it all, Mr. Blake watched with proprietorial satisfaction. Then it happened. Miss Lee, who had been motionless and silent, rose gracefully to pass another bowl to Colonel Melchett. Halfway through the gesture her hand jerked. The porcelain struck the edge of the table, spun crazily, and shattered on the grass. Miss Lee swayed where she stood, her face suddenly drained of colour. "Careful," someone said sharply. "The woman's clumsy." But Miss Lee was not merely clumsy. With a soft, choking sound, she clutched at her throat, her eyes staring. A thin line of green liquid trickled from the corner of her mouth. For one ghastly instant, the polite English lawn seemed to recede, and something strange and terrible looked out through her contorted features. She crumpled at Mr. Blake's feet, quite silently. There was a gasp, a chorus of confused exclamations. Chairs collided, someone screamed. The vicar, very white, pushed forward. "Good heavens," he said hoarsely. "Good heavens, Dr. Haydock." But even as the doctor knelt beside her, Miss Marple, from her chair in the shade, had already stopped knitting. Her hands were very still, and in her gentle lined face there was no surprise at all, only a deep, sorrowful attention. On the crushed grass, among scattered porcelain and spilt green tea, Miss Lee lay perfectly motionless. For several seconds there was only movement without coherence, chairs scraping, voices rising, the faint tinkle of porcelain underfoot as someone stepped back too hastily. Then Colonel Melchett's training asserted itself. "Everyone keep calm," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "No one is to leave this room." Haydock? Dr. Haydock had already loosened the tight mandarin collar of Mrs. Hartwell's dress and laid 2 fingers against her throat. He remained there a moment, his face grim. "She's gone," he said shortly. Very suddenly, very completely. "Heart?" ventured Mrs. Price Ridley in a hushed tone that carried too far, clutching at her handbag as if it might shield her. "Possibly," said Haydock. His eyes, however, strayed to the small broken cup at their feet, and then to the tea tray. "Possibly not." In the corner, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She appeared to be occupied in counting stitches, but her gaze lifted once to the waste bowl containing the discarded first infusion, then passed serenely over each face in turn. She did not, however, contradict Dr. Haydock's carefully non-committal answer. There are moments, she had often reflected, when silence is more revealing than speech. Timothy Hartwell sprang to his feet, his voice hoarse. "This is absurd. My aunt. She can't just. Someone must phone." "The police?" said Colonel Melchett dryly. "As you see, they are already here, Hartwell. But yes, we shall need an inspector from the county headquarters. And an ambulance. Miss Marple, might I trouble you?" "Of course, Colonel." Miss Marple rose, moving with surprising swiftness for one of her years. "I will ask Griselda to telephone at once. I'm sure the vicar will know the proper number." She slipped quietly from the room, a small, unthreatening figure in dove grey, and left behind her a silence suddenly aware of itself. It was Caroline Winters who broke it with a dry sob. "She was perfectly well this morning," Caroline whispered, staring at the still form. "We were going over the guest list for the Garden 50. She laughed at the vicar's suggestion of a coconut shy. How can she be dead now?" Miss Marple, pausing in the hall to speak to the vicar's maid, heard the words faintly through the open door. "Sudden death is very like that," she remarked gently as she returned a few minutes later. "Here one moment, gone the next." One thinks of poor old Mr. Harper, who choked on a fishbone at the Blue Boar. He was only halfway through his whiting. Timothy rounded on her, his temper frayed. "This is hardly the time for village anecdotes, Miss Marple." "No, indeed," she agreed mildly. "And yet, you know, I always think that the way people die tells one a great deal about the way they have lived. Or what has led up to it." Colonel Melchett cleared his throat. "Until the inspector arrives, No one is to touch anything on that table. Is that understood? Haydock, you suspect. I suspect nothing, said Dr. Haydock sharply. I observe. She drank, she convulsed, she died. That could be any one of several things. A stroke, an aneurysm, a severe allergic reaction, or something placed in that cup. All eyes turned instinctively toward Mr. Chen Wei. The old man stood motionless, his face grey beneath his yellowed skin. His gnarled hand still clutched the Yixing teapot as if it were the only solid thing in the room. I do not understand, he said slowly. It is impossible. I brewed this tea as I always do. See, he gestured with the pot, then stopped at Melchort's quick movement. I taste it myself. He lifted the spout slightly toward his own cup, still full and untouched. Leave it, snapped the colonel. No one drinks anything until the inspector's seen it. Miss Marple's eyes had travelled not to the teapot, but to the row of tiny cups before each guest. Several remained full, steam still curling faintly from their surface. 2 were empty, Mrs. Hartwell's broken one, and another, intact but drained, in front of an unexpectedly composed figure. She observed, and said nothing at all. The faint wail of a police siren drifted in from the lane, thin and reedy in the summer air. It seemed oddly out of place amid the scent of roses and oolong. Colonel Melchort straightened. That'll be Slack, he muttered. Good man, though inclined to jump at the obvious. His gaze once more swept the room. Until he arrives, no one touches anything. That includes the tea. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. It was curious, she reflected, how often people obeyed instructions not because they were sensible, but because they were crisply delivered. And yet at that very moment, one guest had the presence of mind, or the habit, to move his empty cup an inch nearer his saucer, aligning it with unconscious neatness. Dr. Haydock, who had drunk his tea without apparent ill effect. Inspector Slack entered with his usual air of irritated competence, a stout constable in tow. He took in the scene, body, tea-table, scattered guests, with a single sweep of the eye. "Afternoon, sir," he said to Melchort. "Got your call. Death at a tea party, never thought I'd see the day." "Doctor, you've confirmed it's not natural?" "Very far from it," Haydock replied dryly. "Acute cyanide poisoning. Sudden, violent, only Mrs. Hartwell affected." Slack's gaze went at once to Mr. Chen, who still stood by the tea-table, the clay teapot cradled like a child. "And this gentleman?" "Mr. Chen Wei," Mrs. Price Ridley interposed, with a certain relish. "Brought down from London to perform this foreign spectacle." Slack sniffed. "We'll have your particulars presently, sir. For now, nobody leaves, nobody touches anything." His eyes narrowed on the cups. "You say only Mrs. Hartwell drank?" Miss Marple's gaze dropped momentarily to Dr. Haydock's empty cup, but she did not speak. It was not that she wished to conceal, only that it was seldom wise to offer information before watching what people volunteered or forgot to say. Timothy cleared his throat. Aunt Constance drank first. The rest of us hadn't quite got to it. There was some question about whether we should hold the cups a particular way. Mr. Chen seized on this eagerly. Yes, proper way is to hold with 3 fingers, not grasp like mug. I was just showing when his voice broke, and he looked helplessly at the lifeless form in the chair. Slack scribbled in his notebook. So. Lady drinks, collapses, nobody else even sips. Convenient that. Caroline Winters lifted her head from her handkerchief. "You can't mean that poor Mr. Chen." "I'm not meaning anything yet, miss," Slack interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I am asking who had access to that particular cup." "Everyone knew it was her favourite," Timothy said heavily. "The Phoenix cup. She always used it. It was in her cabinet in the morning. I saw her take it out and polish it herself. She was most particular about it," added Mrs. Price Ridley. "Wouldn't let her maid handle it. Said village girls were too clumsy." Miss Marple looked down at the glittering shards on the carpet. A favourite object, always used, always in the same place. In St Mary Mead, that sort of predictability had on one or two memorable occasions ended unfortunately. "Colonel," she said mildly, "do forgive an old woman meddling, but in my experience, when something dreadful happens during a social occasion, one must consider not only what was done that day, but what was known beforehand. People do form such easily observed habits." Slack gave her a look of resigned recognition. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I've not forgotten the business with the chemist in Much Benham. You'll have your say, never fear, but let's get the straightforward facts first." Straightforward facts, Miss Marple reflected, were a little like the first infusion of tea, poured away by most people as useless, yet containing, to a careful observer, the first hint of bitterness. Her eyes moved again, unobtrusively, around the room. Timothy's hand still rested on Caroline's shoulder, but his gaze was fixed on the phoenix fragments with something more than grief. Mrs. Price Ridley sat very upright, lips compressed, as though holding back words she longed to utter. Mr. Chen seemed genuinely bewildered and frightened, and Dr. Haydock, whose cup alone was empty, watched the proceedings with his usual sardonic detachment, but there was a faint, uncharacteristic tightness around his mouth. It was all, Miss Marple thought, exceedingly instructive. By evening, the news had travelled the length and breadth of St Mary Mead in that mysterious, instantaneous fashion peculiar to English villages, so that by the time Miss Marple sat down to a simple supper with the vicar and Griselda, the murder at the Chinese tea ceremony had already acquired embellishments quite foreign to the actual events. "I hear," Griselda announced, as she set down a dish of shepherd's pie, that poor Mrs. Hartwell was found clutching a strand of long black hair in her hand, obviously belonging to the mysterious Mr. Chen. The vicar frowned. "My dear, I happen to know from Colonel Melchett that there was nothing of the sort." "Well, no," Griselda admitted cheerfully, "but it sounds so much more dramatic that way." Miss Marple smiled faintly. People do like to embroider tragedies. It makes them easier to talk about. A straightforward poisoning at tea seems almost, well, indecorous. Indecorous? Griselda stared. "Jane," she dropped dead into the nastiest green silk I've ever seen. "If that's not decorous enough for you, not the death, my dear. The method. Poison in a teacup is rather horribly intimate, if you think about it. So very easy, so very sudden. One expects something, more ceremonious perhaps, when a life is to be taken." The vicar shuddered. "Please, Jane." They ate in silence for a few moments. At last he said, Have you any idea?" "I have noticed a few things," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But ideas, Leonard, are rather dangerous at this stage. They have a tendency to become prejudices before one has all the facts." Griselda leaned forward, her eyes bright. "You do think it's murder, then? Not some strange Chinese heart attack?" Dr. Haydock was quite clear, Miss Marple said. "Cyanide has a very particular signature. Besides, dear Griselda, people simply do not collapse in the middle of an announcement about altering their wills without there being some strong feeling on somebody's part." Griselda's fork froze midway to her mouth. "Altering her will? You didn't mention that." "Timothy did," Miss Marple said gently. "In the drawing-room, just after poor Mrs. Hartwell died. I thought it rather brave of him, actually. Most people in his position would have tried very hard not to remember such a remark." "His position?" the vicar repeated. "Being her principal heir. At least under the present arrangement. It is remarkable," she added pensively, "how often death arrives just before a solicitor's appointment, and how seldom just after." Later, when supper was cleared away and the vicar had gone to write his Sunday sermon, Griselda settled herself with a fashion magazine, while Miss Marple took up her knitting again. "I met Caroline Winters in the village this afternoon," Griselda remarked casually. "She looks dreadful. Dark circles, swollen eyes, the complete tragic heroine. I must say she wears grief rather prettily." "Caroline is very young," Miss Marple said. "Young people feel things so very much, especially when they don't quite know what it is they are feeling." Griselda lowered the magazine. "You don't think she's actually sorry about Mrs. Hartwell?" From all accounts, Mrs. H wasn't exactly delighted about the engagement. Objection isn't quite the same as opposition, Miss Marple murmured. And then there is dependency to be considered. Caroline is devoted to Timothy. Timothy is financially dependent on his aunt. It makes a very uncomfortable triangle, I've always thought. Griselda regarded her sharply. You noticed something at the tea, didn't you? You had that look. I noticed, Miss Marple said, with what might almost have been complacency, that Dr. Haydock had finished his tea. An unusual thing to do, under the circumstances. Under what circumstances? When one is called upon quite suddenly to examine a dying woman, Miss Marple said. Most people would forget their tea entirely. And yet his cup was quite empty. Griselda frowned. You think he, Jane, my dear. I do not think anything yet, Miss Marple said placidly. I merely observe. And I have always found that when one person behaves unlike himself, it is far more significant than when a foreign visitor behaves unlike us. Out in the lane, the sound of hurried footsteps passed the vicarage gate. Voices drifted faintly on the evening air, sharp, excited, tinged with fear. The village was turning the day's horror over and over, like crows worrying at something bright in a field. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, steady and inexorable. Somewhere among all those voices, she knew, lay the small revealing slip that would set everything in its true order. The following morning brought a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to press the village roofs down into themselves, turning St. Mary Mead inward and reflective. Miss Marple sat by her front window with her knitting, watching the blurred figures pass along the lane with the purposeful aimlessness that always followed a local tragedy. People went out, not because they had business, but because news did not travel well through closed doors. She did not have long to wait. Griselda, the vicar's lively young wife, arrived with the air of someone carrying a delicious but rather indigestible secret. Jane, I simply must talk to someone sane, she announced, casting off her wet cloak. The whole village has gone quite mad over this Chinese tea business. Half of them have Timothy hanged, and the other half have deported poor Mr. Chen already. Miss Marple poured tea and listened as Griselda settled herself. There's something else, Griselda said, lowering her voice instinctively. Leonard has just come back from seeing Mr. Petherick, the solicitor. It seems Mrs. Hartwell did more than talk about altering her will. She'd actually written instructions, though they hadn't been formally signed. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Oh? That is most enlightening. Apparently she meant to create a trust for Timothy, enough to keep him comfortable but not extravagant. But the interesting part is that she was planning a very substantial bequest to Caroline. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. To Miss Winters? Griselda nodded. Yes. Some nonsense about good influence and deserving youth. Leonard says Petherick hinted that Mrs. Hartwell had been rather disillusioned with her nephew's behaviour of late. Cards, a bit of speculation, that sort of thing. How very like human nature, Miss Marple murmured. To reward the person one believes can be improved, and restrain the one who cannot. It makes Caroline look very awkward, doesn't it? Griselda said, biting her lip. Benefiting so much from her almost mother-in-law's death. Awkward. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though awkward circumstances do not always mean guilty people. Still, such changes to a will do have a curious way of hastening mortality. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a deliberate walk toward the Hartwell house. The police had gone for the moment, leaving only a constable at the gate. Timothy, looking aged by 10 years, emerged from the side door and stopped short at the sight of her. Miss Marple. I suppose you've come to see the scene of the crime, he said bitterly. I've come, she replied gently, to see a young man in trouble. That is quite a different thing, he hesitated, then almost sagged. They've practically decided, you know. Slack all but told me so. Cyanide in my gloves, my supposed quarrel with Aunt Constance. And yet she had just promised to help us. She said yesterday morning she would make everything right. Did she use those words, dear? Make everything right? Yes. She said she'd seen a side of Caroline she greatly admired, and that it was time I learned responsibility. Then she laughed and said I would thank her one day. People rarely thank others for responsibility in the moment, Miss Marple said dryly. Tell me, Timothy, did your aunt have any quarrels of late? Anyone she had? Disappointed, perhaps? He frowned, thinking. There was something with Mr. Chen, he said slowly, 2 nights ago. I came in late and heard them in the drawing room. Aunt Constance was talking about changing arrangements and being tired of dependence. His voice sounded very strained. How curious, Miss Marple said, filing that away. And what about Caroline? Had there been any misunderstandings there? Timothy's jaw tightened. Aunt Constance could be very managing. She'd taken to summoning Caroline here alone, said she wanted to talk sense into the girl. Caroline hated it, but she wouldn't tell me what they discussed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the drawing-room window where the tea ceremony had unfolded. She imagined the careful placing of the cups, the predictable choice of the phoenix pattern, the knowledge of who would sit where. So many conversations, she said softly. And one must ask, of course, which of them someone found quite intolerable. Inspector Slack's growing satisfaction with his case against Timothy Hartwell met a quiet but immovable resistance in Colonel Melchett, and an even subtler one in Miss Marple. By the 3rd day, Slack had gathered statements, traced the cyanide to the Hartwell potting shed, and constructed a plausible narrative involving greed, impatience, and a compromised engagement. Yet something in the neatness of it disturbed those who knew human nature rather than procedure. It was Dr. Haydock who voiced the first explicit doubt when he encountered Miss Marple outside the post office that afternoon. Slack set on young Timothy, he said in a low voice, but there are oddities. Mrs. Hartwell's dosage was quite large, far more than needed, almost as though someone wanted to be absolutely certain, or perhaps wasn't very experienced in such matters. Like an amateur cook who adds too much salt, Miss Marple suggested mildly. One does tend to overdo things one cannot properly judge. Exactly. And there's another point. Do you recall that empty cup of mine at the ceremony? I examined it later. There was no cyanide, of course, but there was something. Traces of a sedative I occasionally prescribe. Harmless in that tiny quantity, but it shouldn't have been there at all. Miss Marple's pale eyes widened just a fraction. How very curious. And you are quite certain you did not dose it yourself? Certainly not. I drink my tea black and unembellished. I suspect someone tampered with it before the ceremony. Possibly as a trial, Miss Marple mused. Or perhaps to see whether a substance would be detectable in tea. They walked in thoughtful silence for a few moments until Miss Marple spoke again, very gently. Dr. Haydock, has Caroline Winters ever had occasion to assist you with your medicines? Fetching, measuring, anything of that nature? Good Lord, no, he said promptly, then hesitated. Though now you mention it, she did come by last week to collect sleeping drops for her father. I was out, but my assistant dispensed them under my instructions. Why? Because, you see, Miss Marple replied, Caroline seems to have developed quite an acquaintance with sedatives of late. And that sort of practical experience does change one's view of dosages and effects. Her thoughts were interrupted that evening by an urgent knock at her door. It was Griselda again, this time pale and shaken. Jane, you must come to the vicarage at once, she said breathlessly. There's been another incident. Not a death, thank heavens, but Leonard's in a state and I don't know what to do. At the vicarage, Miss Marple found Leonard Clement standing in his study, distraught, beside a small table laid for tea. On the tray sat a familiar small clay teapot, identical to the one used at Mrs. Hartwell's ceremony, and beside it an overturned cup with a dark stain spreading across a linen cloth. It was left on our back step, he explained, with a note asking us to reflect on the true nature of charity. Griselda was about to pour when I noticed the smell. Miss Marple leaned closer and inhaled delicately. The bitter almond scent was unmistakable. Cyanide again, she said softly. Someone wished to send a message, and perhaps create a fresh tragedy as well. Though this time, it appears, Providence intervened in the form of your good nose, Vicar. Slack will say this confirms Timothy's guilt, Leonard groaned. Retaliation against the church for Mrs. Hartwell's intended will, no doubt. Or, Miss Marple murmured, her knitting bag hanging lightly from her arm, it might suggest that the killer feels insufficiently appreciated. Some people do become quite reckless when their artistry goes unrecognised. She straightened, her mind sharper than ever. A second cyanide attempt, theatrical and symbolic rather than merely practical, changed the shape of the whole affair. This was no simple killing for money. It had become something more elaborate, more personal, a story someone was determined to tell in poison and porcelain. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime reading the stories people wrote in their own behaviour, knew that a dramatist of this sort would, in the end, insist on being understood. Caroline did not die. Dr. Haydock, summoned with haste, worked over her with brisk efficiency, administering an emetic and issuing precise instructions before having her carried to the small spare room at the Winters cottage. When at last he emerged, wiping his hands on a towel, Inspector Slack was waiting in the narrow passageway, his expression half triumphant, half vexed. "Well?" Slack demanded. Conscience caught up with her, did it? "She's alive," Haydock replied shortly. "Weak, drowsy, but she'll recover." It wasn't a serious attempt, more for effect than anything. Enough chloral to render her unconscious, but nowhere near a lethal dose. "Staged remorse, then," Slack said with satisfaction. Another nail in her coffin, if you'll pardon the expression. Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly by the umbrella stand, looked up. "Or staged despair, perhaps," she suggested mildly. "There's a difference, I always think, between wanting to die and wanting others to believe one has tried." Slack gave her a puzzled glance. "Meaning what exactly, Miss Marple?" "Only that young women in tragic circumstances sometimes resort to dramatic gestures rather than permanent ones. I've observed it before." She looked thoughtfully down the passageway toward the room where Caroline lay. "Did she ask for anyone in particular? Dr. Haydock, when she came round?" Haydock hesitated slightly. She murmured Timothy's name once or twice, but when fully conscious she asked for her father. "He's away visiting his sister in Market Basing. I sent a telegram." "Curious," Miss Marple said softly. "To seek the protection of a father one has deliberately drugged. Human nature is so contradictory." Slack bristled. "You think she didn't really want him safely out of the way?" "Oh, I think she wanted him out of the way very much indeed," Miss Marple replied. "But not perhaps for the reason she gave. An invalid father can be a most inconvenient witness, you know. They sit so quietly in corners, seeing far more than others suspect." As they spoke, Timothy arrived, white-faced and wild-eyed, pushing past Slack with scant ceremony. He burst into Caroline's room, only to emerge minutes later looking more stricken than before. "She won't look at me," he said dully to Miss Marple. "Says I've ruined everything simply by existing." "What can that possibly mean?" "People often exaggerate when they are frightened," Miss Marple said gently, "particularly when they have placed their hopes on a very precarious arrangement." That evening, while the village hummed with speculation about Caroline's attempt and Timothy's supposed involvement, Miss Marple paid a quiet call on Dr. Haydock under the pretext of returning a borrowed medical pamphlet. "You mentioned, Doctor," she said as he poured her a modest sherry, "that Mrs. Hartwell complained about her digitalis tablets, that they made her feel peculiar." Haydock nodded. "She was sensitive to them. I had to keep her on a low dose." "And yet," Miss Marple continued innocently, "is it not true that digitalis and cyanide can produce somewhat similar initial symptoms to the untrained eye? Sudden collapse, disturbed heartbeat, rapid death if the dose is high enough?" "To the untrained eye, yes," Haydock conceded, "though not to mine." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly, "and there, I think, lies something most important. Only someone with medical knowledge could be certain which was which, could rely on the difference being missed or detected at will." He looked at her sharply. "What are you suggesting, Jane?" "Only this," she replied. that whoever planned misses. Hartwell's death understood both her heart condition and the effects of poison well enough to choose cyanide over a more subtle adjustment of her prescribed medicine. A curious choice, wouldn't you say, for a killer who wished to escape detection? Haydock frowned, the implication settling uneasily. You mean they wanted it to be obvious poisoning, not a natural failure of the heart? Precisely, which suggests, does it not, that the true object might not have been simply Mrs. Hartwell's swift removal, but the particular scandal and suspicion that must follow such an unmistakable act. She rose to go, leaving him with that thought. Outside, beneath the dripping trees, Miss Marple paused, her mind sifting through impressions, a staged suicide that did not quite convince, a will restructured to favour one person yet provoking fear in another, and most disturbingly, a crime that seemed designed not merely to kill, but to cast shadows in very specific directions. Someone, she felt certain, was using Caroline Winters and Timothy Hartwell as pieces in a much older, much darker game. For a moment, they regarded one another in the narrow corridor, a frail elderly lady with her neat ball of wool, and a middle-aged country doctor whose eyes had grown strangely opaque. Then Dr. Haydock laughed, not heartily, but with a short, sharp sound. You always did suspect the worst of human nature, Miss Marple. I suppose it's what makes you so very successful. I do not suspect the worst, she corrected him gently. I merely take note of what people do, rather than what they say of themselves. And what you have noted, it seems, he said slowly, is that I had both the knowledge and the opportunity to kill my patient, that I manipulated her medication, and then staged a dramatic Eastern tea ritual as my final stroke. The tea ritual was not your idea, Miss Marple reminded him mildly. That came from Mrs. Hartwell herself, after her travels. But yes, you had every opportunity. You visited regularly. You would know how far you could push her dosage without arousing suspicion. A muscle twitched in his jaw. You're forgetting one thing. Why? What possible reason would I have to see Constance Hartwell dead? Ah, yes, Miss Marple said softly. Motive. It is so often the most delicate thread, and yet the most decisive. You see, Doctor, village life affords one a peculiar window into people's private griefs. She looked at him almost kindly. Particularly when they concern the loss of a son in unfortunate circumstances. He stiffened. You mean Edward? Yes. A promising young man, sent down from medical school after that regrettable incident with the misprescribed sedatives. You believed, I think, that Mrs. Hartwell could have salvaged his reputation, her influence, her money, perhaps a discreet placement abroad. Instead, she cut off his allowance entirely and called him unfit for serious responsibility. Rather harsh words, which she repeated to Mrs. Bantry in the grocer's shop, not realising that Mrs. Bantry repeats everything. Haydock's composure cracked for an instant, revealing a raw, pulsing anger beneath. She destroyed him, he said hoarsely. A single mistake, and she condemned him for life. Do you know what that kind of disgrace does to a young man? I fear I can imagine, Miss Marple said quietly. Young Mr. Denham from Market Basing did something quite similar in 32. He ended by throwing himself from Waterloo Bridge, and you think I chose instead to throw Constance to the wolves, Haydock said bitterly. Revenge for my son's ruin. I think, Miss Marple replied, eyes steady, that someone in this village cared very deeply about a ruined young man. Whether that was you, Doctor, or someone else entirely, remains to be seen. But whoever it was, they chose a remarkably elaborate method, one that relied on specialised knowledge and on precisely timed weakness of the heart. He stared at her for a long moment, then his shoulders slumped slightly. You sound almost disappointed, Miss Marple. Would you prefer your murderer to be a simple, grasping nephew? I prefer the truth, she said, and truth is rarely simple. Tell me, Doctor, on the day of the tea ceremony, who suggested that you sit where you did, with that particular cup? He blinked. Constance herself. She wanted me near in case the exotic ceremony disagreed with anyone. She was always melodramatic about her health. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, faster now, as if the increased tempo reflected her quickened thoughts. How curious, she murmured, that she would choose to place her doctor at precisely the angle from which he could be seen most clearly by everyone present, and yet least able to reach around her chair without obvious movement. She looked up at him, almost as though someone had suggested that arrangement to her beforehand. A shadow of realization crossed his features. "You think I was being staged?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone has calculated this entire business very carefully indeed. Enough to know that, once cyanide was found, and medical manipulation suspected, all fingers would naturally point to you, Doctor. That is the worst of being eminently qualified. One is so very easy to blame." Down the corridor, a nurse called softly for Dr. Haydock. He straightened, the mask of professional detachment sliding smoothly back into place. "You'll tell Melchett your suspicions, of course," he said. In due time, Miss Marple replied, "But I think, before that, I should like to speak again with Mr. Chen. And with Timothy. And perhaps," she added, her voice almost musing, "have another little look at those pretty Chinese cups, particularly the phoenix one. It is so often in the decorations that people reveal more than they intend." As Haydock left, Miss Marple turned back toward Caroline's room. The girl had spoken of someone moving behind Mrs. Hartwell at the crucial moment. If that someone had not been the doctor, then the circle of suspects narrowed in a most intriguing way. And somewhere, she felt certain, lay a small, almost invisible flaw in the killer's exquisitely staged performance. A flaw she meant, very quietly, to tug. The person who had been remarkably quiet, Miss Marple reflected as she stepped out into the purple-washed evening, was neither loud nor dramatic by nature. Indeed, he had passed almost unnoticed by most, present at the edges, obedient when spoken to, and otherwise silent as furniture. Mr. Chen Wei met her eyes with a flicker of wary respect when she arrived at his modest lodging above the grocer's shop. He had been persuaded to remain in the village pending inquiries, and the little room bore all the marks of a temporary existence, neat, self-contained, with nothing of home. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "you honour me. I thought police had decided Chinese man is not killer this time." "I never thought you were, Mr. Chen," she replied mildly, accepting the hard wooden chair he offered. "But I think you saw more than anyone realized. People do not notice the servant when there is ceremony to watch." He considered this, then nodded. "In my country we say, man who pours tea sees all hands and all faces, even when no one sees his." Exactly. Miss Marple took out her knitting, the familiar click filling the small room with domestic comfort. At the moment the poison must have been introduced, when Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward to admire the wet leaves after the first wash. Where was Dr. Haydock standing? Mr. Chen's memory, sharpened by decades of ritual, did not fail him. Doctor stood to her left near window. He leaned forward also as if to see leaves, but his eyes were not on Pot. They looked beyond at someone else. And whom was he watching? There was a long pause. The policeman. The one with angry face. Slack. He pronounced the name carefully. Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed. "Inspector Slack?" "Yes." He moved behind Mrs. Hartwell very quickly. One step only. Hand went toward cups, then away. "I think maybe he only adjusts tablecloth. But now—" He spread his hands. "Now I am not so sure." Miss Marple rose, her eyes unusually bright. The pattern, the over-eager evidence against Timothy, the conveniently found receipt, the insistence on the foreigner, fell into alignment with a click that was almost audible. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice very gentle, "would you be willing to assist in one more tea ceremony?" "At the vicarage. Tomorrow afternoon." He looked surprised, then slowly bowed. "To show truth, I will pour many cups." The following day dawned clearer, as if the weather itself wished to see matters resolved. At 4 o'clock, the vicarage drawing-room had been transformed with borrowed lacquer, porcelain, and the same clay teapot. Griselda fluttered happily over the arrangements, unaware of the quiet tension beneath. Colonel Melchett stood by the mantel, outwardly placid but watchful. Timothy, pale and thin-lipped, hovered near the window. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual air of brusque propriety, grumbling about nonsense Eastern rituals, yet clearly pleased to be included in what he believed was a harmless reconstruction. Dr. Haydock came last, looking controlled but faintly drawn. Miss Marple, in her customary corner chair with her knitting, seemed the least consequential person present. Now, she said, when everyone was assembled, I thought it might help if Mr. Chen were to repeat, as exactly as possible, the movements of the original ceremony. We shall each take the same positions as before. It is such a comfort, I always think, to revisit events step by step. One notices the smallest things that way. They obeyed, almost despite themselves, habit and her mild authority working together. Mr. Chen positioned the cups precisely as on that fatal afternoon, including a phoenix pattern cup that Miss Marple had located in Mrs. Hartwell's cupboard, part of a pair. We begin, Mr. Chen intoned, with the first infusion. Not for drinking. As before, he filled each cup, then poured their contents into the waste bowl. The familiar movements seemed to soothe everyone. Eyes followed his hands, just as they had that day. Now, Miss Marple murmured. Her own gaze sharpened, if Mrs. Hartwell were to lean forward to admire the leaves. Like so, perhaps. Griselda obligingly leaned over the teapot, mimicking the dead woman's posture. And if anyone wished, in that brief moment, to tamper with a single cup, Miss Marple continued softly, they would have to move very quickly indeed. Almost without thinking. Muscle memory, you know. People so often repeat what they have done before. She let the words hang, then watched. Not the cups, not Mr. Chen, but the men arrayed around the table. Someone moved, just as she had known they would. Colonel Melchett listened in taut silence as Miss Marple laid out her account in his study. Mrs. Price Ridley perched miserably on the edge of a chair, twisting her gloves in anguished hands. Inspector Slack paced, frowning deeply, as each new detail chipped away at his comfortable theory of Timothy Hartwell's guilt. So you see, Colonel, Miss Marple concluded gently. Dr. Haydock had motive, means, and a most particular kind of opportunity. Mrs. Hartwell discovered something damaging about his professional past, and threatened exposure. He responded not impulsively, but with forethought, weakening her heart over weeks, then choosing the Chinese tea ceremony for its ritualistic focus and predictable habits. Habits? Melchett repeated. Yes. Her insistence on that phoenix cup, for one. Everyone knew it was hers. It might as well have had her name painted on it. And her passion for doing things properly guaranteed she would examine the tea leaves herself, leaning forward at the crucial moment. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Dr. Haydock needed only 90 seconds alone with the freshly washed cups, which he obtained when Mrs. Price Ridley, quite innocently, lured him into the drawing room with talk of Mrs. Hartwell's threats. He could then prepare the phoenix cup with cyanide residue that would dissolve fully only when tea from the second infusion was poured in. Slack stopped pacing. And the cyanide receipt in Timothy's shed? Placed there during one of your earlier searches, I'm afraid. A doctor knows exactly how much time the police will take, and how easily a scrap of incriminating paper can be overlooked twice before being triumphantly discovered on the third attempt. Melchett's face had grown grave. And Caroline Winters? She saw movement behind Mrs. Hartwell when all eyes were on Mr. Chen. She did not understand what she'd seen at first. But when she began to recall more clearly, and when she realized someone had tampered with medicines and sedatives in more than one household, she became dangerous to the killer. Miss Marple's voice softened. The chloral hydrate in her shed was not despair, Colonel. It was arrangement. The dry shoes in a muddy garden, the soil under her nails, the bottle placed too conspicuously. Someone wanted us to think she'd tried to take her own life, and failed. There was a long silence. Then Melchett straightened. Very well. Slack, we'll have Haydock brought here. No theatrics. I want him calm. The doctor arrived within the hour, summoned on the pretext of discussing Caroline's condition. He entered with his usual weary professionalism, but his eyes flickered when he saw Miss Marple seated quietly by the window, her knitting in her lap. "Doctor," Melchett began, his voice deceptively cordial, "Miss Marple has been explaining a very interesting theory to us. It concerns digitalis dosages, cyanide solubility, and the curious advantage of a ritual in which everyone watches the teapot, while no one watches the cups." For several minutes Haydock fenced skillfully, denying, deflecting, invoking professional insult. It was Miss Marple in the end who delivered the final gentle twist. "There is one small matter, Doctor," she said. "When you revived Caroline, you remarked, before anyone had spoken of it, that she'd ingested only a token dose of chloral hydrate. You said she was never in real danger. But no one yet knew how much she'd taken. Unless her pale eyes met his steadily, the person who poured it knew precisely how small the amount was." Haydock stared at her. The struggle within him was almost visible. Indignation, calculation, then a weary, terrifying surrender. "You have no idea," he said quietly at last, "what one stupid mistake can cost a man in my profession. Constance meant to ruin me for an error made 10 years ago, and properly acquitted in London. I was not going to watch my life destroyed again, because a bored widow discovered old gossip in a medical journal. And so you chose," Miss Marple said softly, "to destroy hers instead." He gave a short, bitter laugh. She was already halfway there with that heart of hers. "I merely hurried nature along." His gaze moved to Miss Marple with a grudging, almost professional respect. "You see too much, madam." "It is only," she replied, "that people are so very much alike. I once knew a head gardener who poisoned roses he thought unworthy of the beds he tended. He, too, felt justified. When they led him away, the village exhaled in a mix of shock and reluctant relief. Timothy was released, Caroline slowly began to recover, and the Chinese tea set was quietly packed away, never again to grace a St. Mary Mead afternoon. Weeks later, in her rose-scented garden, Miss Marple reflected with her usual mild sadness that nothing, not even murder, was truly exotic. Human vanity, fear, and self-preservation, these were as English as her own teacup, chipped at the rim, always placed in exactly the same spot on the tray. Habits, she thought, were both the comfort and the undoing of mankind. She poured herself a perfectly ordinary cup of tea, looked at the innocent steam curling upward, and resumed her knitting. In the weeks that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest, St. Mary Mead settled back into its accustomed rhythm with the peculiar determination small villages possess, determined to be ordinary even when they know they are not. The roses still bloomed in the vicarage garden, though Griselda confessed she could not look at a teacup without thinking of cyanide, and Mrs. Price Ridley began insisting on examining the inside of every pot before pouring. Timothy Hartwell was released from custody with a brusque apology from Inspector Slack, who clearly considered the whole episode a regrettable misunderstanding rather than a professional embarrassment. Timothy bore it surprisingly well. His usual fecklessness had given way to a subdued gravity. Miss Marple encountered him one afternoon outside the post office, where he stood staring rather blankly at a telegram in his hand. "Aunt Constance's London solicitor," he explained when she inquired gently. Apparently, even without the new will, she'd made certain provisions some time ago. A modest trust for me, enough to live decently if I use my head. He hesitated, then gave a small wry smile. And a very generous legacy for Caroline. She meant to help us both, after all. Mrs. Hartwell was often sharp in her judgments, Miss Marple observed, but not, I think, unkind. Caroline Winters, pale but steadily recovering, had been sent to convalesce with a cousin in Eastbourne. Before her departure, she had come to Miss Marple's cottage, hands still nervous, but eyes clearer than they had been for days. "I feel so ashamed," she had confessed, twisting her handkerchief. "I thought only of my own fears, and not at all of what was being done to others. I let myself be used, by circumstance, by my own cowardice. Dr. Haydock frightened me into silence without ever quite saying anything openly. Fear is a powerful tool in the wrong hands, Miss Marple replied. You are very young, my dear. The important thing is that you did, in the end, dare to remember what you had seen. Many would not have. Caroline had left with tears in her eyes and a new, almost painful honesty in her manner. A young woman who had looked too closely at both love and death and found them terrifyingly intertwined. At the vicarage one evening, over properly unceremonious English tea, Colonel Melchett sat with Miss Marple and Leonard and Griselda Clement, turning matters over with the dogged thoroughness of a man who disliked leaving any thread untidied. What still astonishes me, he said, is how near we came to letting him get away with it. If you hadn't noticed the business with his own cup, Miss Marple— It was not the cup alone, Miss Marple demurred. It was the pattern. A man who has once escaped suspicion for a patient's death learns a dangerous lesson. He discovers that a reputation for competence is a very effective shield. After that, all that is needed is a little theatrical arrangement, an exotic ceremony, a foreign guest, a feckless young heir, and a village eager to believe the worst of its chosen scapegoat. Leonard Clement stirred his tea thoughtfully. It's a sobering thought, that knowledge intended for healing can be turned so precisely to harm. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were mild. Human nature does not change, Vicar. Only the tools we use. A jealous cousin with a knife in the dark is not so very different from a frightened doctor with access to digitalis and chloral hydrate. Each convinces himself that the end justifies the means. And do you never tire of seeing the worst of people, Jane? Griselda asked, watching her with a rare seriousness. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting lying peacefully in her lap. But I do not see only the worst, my dear. I see Mrs. Price Ridley, who thought to protect a man's reputation, even if her discretion was somewhat misplaced. I see Caroline, too frightened at first but capable of courage when it truly mattered. I see a village that, after all, sends flowers to a disgraced doctor's sister in another county, because scandal does not quite extinguish old loyalties. Outside, the evening light softened the village into a picture of tranquil respectability. The Chinese tea set had been quietly packed away by the Hartwell housekeeper, destined, rumour said, for a distant relation who collected such things. Miss Marple, however, continued to take her tea in sturdy English china, finding in its familiar weight a comforting reminder that while manners and costumes might change, the human heart, with its greed, its fear, its odd moments of grace, remained very much the same. And in St. Mary Mead, where nothing ever truly stayed secret for long, she knew that somewhere, in some quiet parlour, the seeds of the next little tragedy were already being sown, over bridge cards or garden fences, or perhaps even another seemingly innocent cup of tea. The true quiet returned to St. Mary Mead not with the arrest, nor with the inquest, but some weeks later, when talk of that dreadful business with the Chinese tea had begun, very delicately, to turn into a village anecdote rather than an open wound. The roses bloomed again in the vicarage garden. The grocer's boy once more delivered cheese with an air of worldly superiority, and Mrs. Price Ridley resumed her rightful place as the village's chief arbiter of what was and was not quite nice. For Miss Marple, the true conclusion came on a mild afternoon when Timothy Hartwell and Caroline Winters appeared together at her garden gate. They looked older, somehow, not in years, but in understanding. Miss Marple Timothy began, after they'd been seated and properly supplied with seed cake. We felt we ought to thank you, not only for clearing my name, but for seeing clearly when the rest of us were muddled. Caroline added, with a shy earnestness, we're leaving St. Mary Mead for a while. Timothy has a position with a firm in Birmingham, quite modest, but steady. We thought, well, it seemed best not to start our life together on Aunt Constance's money alone. Miss Marple smiled, her pale blue eyes kind. Very wise, I'm sure. Money obtained without effort often leads to quite unexpected complications. We read Aunt Constance's old letters together, Caroline went on softly. It was very strange. She wasn't at all the tyrant Timothy thought, nor the saint I imagined. She was rather like everyone, I suppose. Vain in some ways, generous in others, very frightened of being made a fool of. Particularly by doctors, Timothy added ruefully. She'd trusted Haydock utterly. When she realised she might have been mistaken, I suppose that was unbearable to her pride. She had to make a great production of putting it right. As people so often do, Miss Marple agreed. They are rarely content simply to change their minds in private. They must announce it to the world, especially if their earlier judgment was very emphatic. There was a little silence. Then Caroline said, very low, "Do you think I bear any responsibility, Miss Marple?" "For not speaking sooner. For letting myself be frightened into silence." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I have known girls who did much worse things for far less cause. You were afraid, and you were misled by someone whose authority you had been taught to trust. If there is responsibility, and there always is, in all of us, it lies first with the person who chose to abuse that trust." After they had gone, Miss Marple sat for some time with her untouched knitting in her lap. She thought of Dr. Haydock, not as the monster some now called him, but as a frightened man who had chosen vanity and self-preservation over honesty at a crucial moment, and had then been forced, by that first cowardice, further and further along a path that ended at the gallows. It was, she reflected, a most human pattern, one wrong step not acknowledged, one small deception not confessed, could grow into a thing of monstrous proportions. That evening, at the vicarage, Griselda announced that she had taken a firm stand. No more foreign ceremonies, she declared. "We will have tea in thick cups that cannot be poisoned without at least chipping the glaze, and if anyone wishes to be exotic, they may put lemon in it and consider themselves continental." Miss Marple laughed softly, her needles resuming their gentle click. "Rituals are never the danger, my dear," she said. "It is always the people who choose to hide behind them. Murder at a Chinese tea ceremony is not really so different from murder over a parish jumble sale. The human heart remains remarkably consistent." Leonard Clement, refilling her cup, observed with a sigh, and I suppose, Miss Marple, that as long as human nature remains what it is, we shall never be entirely safe. "Safe?" Miss Marple repeated, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps not. But forewarned Mr. Clement is very often forearmed. And if one pays proper attention," her eyes twinkled faintly, "one may at least avoid taking tea from the wrong cup." Outside, the village settled into twilight peace, its small secrets temporarily exhausted, its greater dramas postponed. Somewhere a child laughed, somewhere a dog barked. And in a neat garden at the edge of it all, an elderly lady knitted and watched, and remembered, quite content. For the moment, to let St. Mary Mead believe itself once more perfectly ordinary.